Hi, everyone. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome, welcome. Yeah, first of all, thank you for being here. Just gonna quickly check / amend the settings to make sure that people can just let themselves in. Oh, it looks like that's working now. Perfect, sorted. Yeah, like I said, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. Welcome. So today's session, as it says on the tin, I suppose, or the first slide is all about the importance of boundaries as a manager. So hopefully everyone who's joining us today, you're in some sort of leadership position. So hopefully it'll be useful for you. But we do only have half an hour today, and there's quite a lot to cover. And even with us trying to cover as much as we are today, we really are only scratching the surface in terms of this topic. So just to introduce ourselves for anyone who doesn't know us at PMAC, essentially we specialise in bespoke trainings for workplaces on anything that relates to mental health and well-being, and we're often talking about the importance of boundaries. So this is a topic that we're really passionate about, and something that's been coming up a lot in sessions that we've been doing recently. So we're going to be thinking about what boundaries are, and we're going to think about all the different domains where we might need to consider boundaries and what our limits are. And then we're going to think towards the end of the session today about how do we communicate boundaries, how do we set them, how do we maintain them, whilst also being realistic that this can be uncomfortable for people. Boundaries can be difficult to communicate and set for so many reasons, all of which are valid. And this can be particularly challenging. Something that we keep talking about in sessions with managers is, how challenging it can be to now set boundaries with people where we notice that, maybe our limits have been reached or even surpassed, and yet the benefits of doing so. So, like I said, this is very much an introduction to this topic of boundaries. In this half an hour, we're really only going to be scratching the surface. And to be honest, we could do a whole session, hours of session on just assertive communication. We could do hours of session on what healthy boundaries look like. And we could do a whole session on just one method of communicating boundaries, like the Dear Man method. But hopefully, this will still be somewhat useful for you all. So, when we're talking about boundaries and thinking about boundaries, first of all, we're thinking about limits and rules that we set for ourselves, essentially. And boundaries are for us. They're boundaries for us to be aware of, for us to keep in mind and to hold in mind. They're for us to set, they're for us to maintain. Unfortunately, a lot of responsibility on us. And ultimately with boundaries, actually, to kind of expand on that a little bit, boundaries shouldn't really require anything of anybody else, and they're for us to communicate, and it shouldn't be reliant upon somebody else doing X, Y, or Z. However, we can't always guarantee that people will honour and respect our boundaries and adhere to them, which is where the maintaining boundaries becomes really important as well. And it's important to be aware of the fact that boundaries are going to look different in different areas of our life. That is normal, that is expected, and healthy boundaries are flexible in that way. So even when we think about how much you're willing to discuss about yourself, your personal life, your feelings, your physical health, for example, what you would consider appropriate to discuss and comfortable for you to discuss is going to look very different with, I don't know, your childhood friends versus family. And we all have very different relationships with our family versus with employees and people in your team that you manage versus a new member of staff versus a very close colleague. So these are going to look different in different areas of our life, and that's okay, and that's normal, and that's expected. And it can be useful to be aware of what our limits are and what our boundaries are in advance, essentially, before we enter a situation. Because not only then will it almost take away the decision making in that moment, in terms of I don't have to now overthink and worry and decide what to do, what not to do, because I know what my limits are, I know what my boundaries are, and all I need to do now is reiterate them, maintain them, for example. And also that increases predictability. And having clear boundaries, they're brilliant for our mental health and well-being, for our confidence, for our self-esteem, but there are also lots of benefits for the other person as well, for the other party, which we'll reflect on again a little bit later. So there are opportunities to engage throughout this session, and we would really encourage people to engage however you feel comfortable to do so. Because yeah, I think as managers, it's useful to just reflect and hear from other managers how, we all struggle and things that we all maybe could do with improving and just normalizing all this sort of stuff. So a box might have popped up on your screen, and if not, if you check the chat function, it should be in there. And essentially, we've got a poll. First of all, that just asks, who might you need to set boundaries with? When you're thinking of your role as a manager, who is it that we think you need to have boundaries with and communicate them to? Are we thinking about the people in your team, for example, the employees? Are we thinking about boundaries that you need to communicate and set with your own line managers? What about things like clients or customers? Do we need to set boundaries there? Do we think and be aware of our boundaries? And maybe even ourselves. So with this, you might be able to vote for more than one. Hopefully it gives you the option to do that. And I've just seen in the chat, I think somebody's saying that they would select all of the above, and a couple of people are like that comment. So I feel like other people agree with you there, which is brilliant. At the moment, then, it's looking mostly, so about 30% of people are saying you need to set these with employees, about 25% of thinking about boundaries with your own manager, and another 25% with like customers. And then about 22% saying for yourself. But yeah, as a couple of people mentioned, actually, we need to communicate and set boundaries with all of these. And really, we need to also think about boundaries that we set with ourselves and for ourselves, not just always thinking about what do I say no to, and setting boundaries with our superiors, for example. Boundaries also, as a manager, you might need to think about, reflect on how you honor and respect other people's boundaries if employees are comfortable and able to share that with you as well. Now, like you said, boundaries are not easy to set. They're not. They're not always easy things to communicate with other people, and they can be challenging to maintain. Like we said, we can't guarantee that everybody will absolutely show total respect for our boundaries and honor them, and yeah, show us the respect that we're looking for, essentially. We can't guarantee that. So we need to be realistic before we even talk about boundaries, about the fact that this can be challenging, and that again is very normal and expected. So again, a little box might have popped up on your screen, and anything that you share in there will be shared anonymously, essentially. You can also use the chat function. But just from your perspectives, I suppose, has anyone got any ideas as to why boundaries can be difficult to communicate, why they might be difficult to set? And I'll give people a couple of moments to respond. Okay, brilliant. We've got some stuff already. Being worried about how it's going to be received and worrying about how people are going to think about you are two very, very, very important and valid reasons that people struggle with communicating boundaries. So thank you to the couple of you that have mentioned those. The fear and the unpredictability that can surround other people's reactions can be quite palpable. And for many of us, we've experienced situations in our lives where maybe our boundaries haven't been honoured, where maybe we've experienced things like abuse, for example, or bullying, for example. And so actually the fear and the uncertainty that can surround other people's behaviour and responses to us advocating for ourselves can be very, very, very overwhelming. A boundary is unique to each person, and people might think about their own boundaries rather than yours. Yeah. And when we think about boundary styles, healthy boundaries and assertive communication considers the needs of both parties and considers what's fair. And we don't just solely think about ourselves, essentially, but we can't guarantee that other people will do the same because of time restrictions, because of how other people might interpret your communication. The level of understanding from the other person. Oh, I love this point as well. You might be friends with people. You might have friendships with colleagues, with managers, for example, which might make it harder potentially to communicate boundaries. And often, if we to look at boundaries across different areas of our lives, we often find that for many of us, we do quite well with setting boundaries in some areas of our lives, and in other areas we might really struggle. So someone might be brilliant at maintaining boundaries in work, for example, but really struggle to communicate and set boundaries and limits with friends where it feels harder to do that, or with family, for example. Fear of employee reaction, absolutely. Feeling guilted that my boundaries shouldn't be respected. Yeah, again, other people don't always respect our boundaries and honour them, and that can be really, really, really uncomfortable. And that doesn't mean that we should now completely neglect ourselves and forget about our boundary altogether. It means, unfortunately, we need to maintain it. People being over familiar with you. Yeah, so like the example given here, employees coming late frequently and don't feel the need to apologize. Yeah, that can be a really good sign that maybe we need to set quite a clear boundary here. We might feel guilty. Absolutely. There can be a lot of anticipatory anxiety, in the build up to these conversations, for example. And then at the time, like I said, it can be really uncomfortable. We might feel guilty afterwards. And again, that can be quite common and not a sign that we've done something wrong and we shouldn't have said this. It's just a sign that we're not so comfortable and used to advocating for our needs. And actually, if anything, that can be information that this is something I can work on and get better at so that I don't have to experience this guilt after. And also, this is a brilliant point. Maybe you've received a promotion over existing colleagues, so maybe the dynamics have changed. And we see this and hear this an awful lot, actually, is people who, yeah, we're friends with colleagues, had close relationships, and maybe you've then been promoted to potentially their line manager, and now the dynamics are very, very different. And it's a challenge sometimes to feel like you are earning people's respect. It can be difficult to feel like they are going to listen to you. It can also be quite challenging because people might already then know quite a lot about you that if somebody just started now and joined your team, you wouldn't necessarily share. We've also got in the chat, I'm just having a quick look through this. Worried about coming across as rude, absolutely. Not understanding what our own boundaries are until they're challenged, yeah. And this is the thing, like often we don't recognize what our limits are and where we can set boundaries until they've been surpassed. And we're going to touch on that and the benefits of using that as information rather than an opportunity to beat ourselves up. Relationships breaking, feeling like you're not doing your job properly or being rude if you set them. People who in your spicy can struggle to vocalize their boundaries as they may have grown up being told what their boundaries should be, absolutely. And yeah, there can be real challenges for neurodivergent people with communicating boundaries and getting the balance right. Again, communicating boundaries in a way that people don't perceive you to be being too rude or demanding. And often we notice that people might engage in very passive kind of communication styles and appear as people pleasing because that was the safest thing to do. Changes of circumstances and changing boundaries. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you everyone so much. So before we start talking about some specifics, has anybody got any sort of specific areas already in mind where you feel like it is useful or necessary for either yourself or other managers to have in mind? So whether that relates to, as somebody mentioned earlier, things like workload or like I've mentioned, the types of things that you share about yourself, about your personal life, about your finances, for example. Are there any areas that you think might be particularly important for managers to consider when it comes to boundaries? And also one thing to, just while it's fresh in my mind here for a second, one thing that I think is really important is boundaries are so important. I know we touched on how they're important for mental health and well-being, but actually things like there's some research that's found that managers actually are at an increased risk of experiencing burnout compared to the people in your team. So boundaries are even more important in some domains. So we've got some brilliant responses here. Thank you so much. So gossip has come up a couple of times. So yeah, so not engaging in gossip, being mindful about how we interact with and engage with and maybe interject in conversations that we overhear maybe that are gossipy in nature and maybe quite critical of other people. Our time as a manager, setting expectations of behaviours, tasks, and giving but particularly receiving feedback. Yeah, as managers, we might need to be open to, and it's important to be open to receiving feedback. We've got things like physical contact. Yes, and this is something we've been talking about recently quite a bit as well. We all have different boundaries related to physical contact, like I said, touching, an arm around the shoulder, hugging, for example. But it's particularly important as a manager that we're aware of the fact that there is an inherent power imbalance, and people might not always feel so comfortable to advocate for themselves with us as managers, and to say that they're not comfortable with things. So setting that boundary from the outset that, that isn't something that you'll engage in, for example, is useful. Overall work-life balance, stop overworking, how your colleagues talk to you, whether it's people above you or those that you line manage, calling and texting outside of work. Brilliant, thank you. And this is something we're going to talk about because this is coming up consistently recently when we've been doing sessions with managers, particularly around mental health and wellbeing. Not oversharing personal information, protecting your own time, dealing with weaponized incompetence so everything doesn't fall back to you, adhering to staff code of conduct. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you everyone so much. And I'll just quickly check the word cloud again. Yeah, brilliant as well. So there's things like the time boundaries, contact outside of work again, the emotional impact of others, venting, blaming, impacting you, being impartial. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. So there are many, many areas that we might need to consider reflecting on, to consider what our limits are and setting boundaries. So again, as managers, actually, like I said, you can be at an increased risk of burnout. If there are staff shortages, there are sicknesses, that might mean that things fall to you to pick up additional work, take on additional responsibilities on top of your day-to-day work. And you might be doing things like recruiting on top of that. It might also be things like thinking about how much you delegate, and then once you have delegated, trusting people to get on with those tasks, trusting that we can correct things down the line and feedback versus running the risk potentially micromanaging, which often potentially stems for our anxiety around how things are going to be done or not done. Time boundaries are something that has been really, really important and coming up time and time again recently for us in sessions. So thinking about working hours and availability. And again, when we've been doing sessions, it's often been managers recently that are telling us that they are working late, staying late often, working over the weekend often, working late into the night on the weekends, even, working on annual leave, working, pulling all-nighters sometimes. So it can be really, really, really important to be mindful about, there are going to be times potentially, and again, healthy boundaries are kind of flexible to an extent. But there might be times where it is a very, very busy period, and maybe we might need to work a little bit later to stay on top of things, or maybe for your sake and for your future self and your well-being, you would rather do a couple of hours while you're off to catch up on emails so there's less to come back to. And that's okay if that works for you and that doesn't impact your mental health and well-being. And we still might need to set limits with ourselves in terms of how many hours am I prepared to work late? How many nights in 1 week am I prepared to work late? If I'm on annual leave and I'm telling myself I'm just going to quickly check emails, for how long are you going to do that? Because if we don't go into these situations with limits, like we said, and kind of pre-existing boundaries we've set with ourselves, we're more likely to surpass our limits and then end up, like we've mentioned, feeling guilty, feeling annoyed, feeling resentful, for example. We might also need to be mindful about digital boundaries. So things like boundaries around how much you use things like your phone, your laptops. Is it out when you're off work? Are you still receiving notifications long into the night? Are other people working late and sending you emails, sending you pieces of work late, and so you then feel a responsibility for you to be reading it, actioning this stuff, replying to show that you're just as committed? Whereas actually we can look at this the other side and think about leading by example and normalizing and communicating that healthy boundaries and switching off after work and having that work-life separation is necessary for productivity. It's necessary for our well-being. So thinking about, even actually something we've been speaking about recently is like just even things like what kind of WhatsApp groups are you part of? Are you off work and receiving lots and lots of notifications just from colleagues chatting about work? What kind of accounts are you following on social media? Are you officially off work and kind of unwinding, and actually you're sat watching accounts that talk about the areas that you work, in which case we're now also still thinking about work when we're trying to be off work and trying to just sit on social media. Communication can be really important. So thinking about what you do and don't share about yourself, your personal experiences, your life. Some managers are going to feel safer and more comfortable to share a little bit more. It's going to depend on the dynamics. It's going to depend on you again. But for other people, this can be quite a clear and firm boundary where people don't share quite so much about themselves for fear that things will be used against them. And even thinking about professional conduct when you are out at like Christmas parties, which are coming up, and being mindful about maybe how much alcohol you have, because it might run the risk of you then potentially oversharing and sharing things that now feel like it's blurred the boundaries when you go back into work on Monday and you've got to have professional conversations with people. Emotional boundaries, so as people have said, like thinking about how we offer emotional support without becoming over involved, without becoming somebody's therapist, essentially, without then feeling like you are responsible and have to reply to emails, messages, calls, voice notes being sent at all hours at the evening, at the weekend when you're on annual leave because somebody's struggling, for example. This is something that we've been hearing a lot about, is, particularly if employees have been struggling, they are feeling overwhelmed, that managers are struggling to kind of communicate that yes, I'm available and I want to support you. And I also have to think about my emotional health and well-being, and answering calls at 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning is not conducive to looking after me, essentially. Material boundaries even. So things like not only like allocating resources fairly within your teams, but also, again, actually thinking about, are you as a manager giving people lifts all of the time, actually driving 15 minutes out of your way, each way, every day? You're getting no petrol money, you're lending personal equipment, lending money even is something that we have heard about, letting people stay at your house while they're having a bit of a tricky time. All of those things are going to blur the boundaries and put you at risk of feeling uncomfortable, compromised. It might make it harder for you to engage in conversations about performance, about improving performance, about all the sorts of conversations that we have to have sometimes as managers that can be tricky at the best of times. Things like, just like we said, even just thinking about material boundaries and materials and possessions can be something that we don't necessarily pay as much attention to. And then again, energy as well. When we think about our energy as managers, like, we don't just want to think about your time and how much time you're spending working, but also, are you giving so much of yourself? Maybe again, you're neurodivergent also, or you have perfectionist tendencies and you're hyper focused and you give so much to your work and you try so hard to please everyone in your teams that by the time you finish work, or when the weekend comes around, or you're on annual leave, you've got no energy left for any other areas of your life. At which point we are at an increased risk then of experiencing burnout. So like I said, not even just about the time that we're spending in work, but also like how much energy, how much of your personal resources are you giving to work? And is there anything left for you for other areas of your life? So, like we said, those are just a very brief introduction to different areas of our working lives and existence where we might need to think about boundaries. But are there any in particular, as we were going through that people reflected are harder, or are more challenging to set and maintain, for example? And we only ask this again, like we said, to just try and normalize the fact that there are going to be areas that potentially all of us struggle with to some extent or other. And that's okay. That's information that we can use, and that we can try to do something differently about, just in case that maybe makes a difference. We're not guaranteeing that everything is going to go to plan, but we're trying to increase the likelihood of these things not impacting you quite so much. So we've got some brilliant responses here. Thank you so much. So things like emotional boundaries, not taking on the team's emotional issues quite so much, and setting boundaries with your own managers can be really difficult. as in you're a spicy person with high level of empathy, struggle to not be seen as a pushover. Yeah. So being more assertive potentially, which can be a real challenge, and not being quite so passive, and being mindful of things like what's called like impulsive compliance that often neurodivergent people struggle with, where when you're asked to do something, your impulse is to agree and to try to please other people. And it means before you've even had a second to catch your thought, and again, many people here might recognize this as I'm talking about this, your immediate instinct is to say yes, to agree, to take on more than you know, even in advance, is reasonable and that might impact you. We've also got things like, yeah, challenges with the dynamics with things like friendship, colleagues, managers. So yes, again, maybe around conversational and emotional boundaries. So like we said, boundaries can be very difficult to set at first. And again, healthy boundaries are somewhat flexible. Like I said, during a really busy period, you might need to work a little bit longer, but again, with a limit in terms of how late you're going to work, how many nights a week are you going to work, for example. Maybe you've got an employee who is really struggling, and so we try to offer them slightly more support, wellbeing check-ins slightly more often, but still with a limit, and you're not available at the evenings, at the weekends, and any time. And the discomfort that can come with communicating boundaries is often lower, the kind, and lesser, I suppose, than the longer term discomfort that comes with feeling completely out of control and almost at other people's whim. So, how to set and maintain boundaries? First of all, it can be useful to reflect on your emotions, actually. So, when you've maybe had a conversation, you've agreed to do something, you've agreed to take on extra work, you've taken something off somebody because they said that they felt a little bit overwhelmed, but you're now going to have to do something. Reflecting on, how did I feel after that? Did I feel annoyed, guilty, resentful, annoyed with myself, deflated, sad, upset? All of that is quite useful information that some sort of limit has been surpassed. So self-reflection, looking back after conversations without judgment, without criticizing ourselves, because actually we've now got information that we can do something about, and we can hold in mind and think about what our limits might be, what our boundaries might be, so that we've got the opportunity to communicate them as soon as possible in future. When we are communicating boundaries, we want to be as direct as possible. So there's a difference between being rude and being assertive. And quite fundamentally, actually, when we're talking about boundaries, sometimes no is a full sentence. But when we talk about being direct here, sometimes if we struggle and we're more passive in our communication, we might waffle and go so round the houses, and actually not, as much as it's really clear to us that we're trying to say, I don't want to do this, I can't do this, I don't want to talk about this with you, it actually might not be very clear to the other person. So just some kind of tips. And again, we could spend hours talking about specific tips around communicating boundaries in the Dear Man method, but just a couple of tips, I suppose, is first of all, if you're communicating a boundary, using I statements, which increase the likelihood actually of the other person taking it a bit better, because it doesn't feel quite so accusatory. So rather than you're distracting me, think about, I need some time to focus on this task, rather than you're asking too much of me, or you keep calling me all hours and it's not fair. I feel really worried and I struggle to maintain my work-life balance if I see that you're calling me at 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm now then worried about you. So using I statements versus you're doing this, you're taking up too much time, you're distracting me, can increase the likelihood that people respect our boundaries. We can't absolutely guarantee it, but we increase the likelihood of getting a better response. And sometimes we need to use what's called the broken record technique. So where we kind of calmly but consistently repeat our boundary if people aren't seeming to take it, such as just repeating, yeah, I can absolutely understand things are busy at the moment. And like I said, I'm not available today after 5 p.m, unfortunately. And it's important where we can to appear confident doing this. It doesn't mean that we are confident and we do feel completely fine doing this, but things like maintaining appropriate eye contact, which again, if when you're a divergent, that might be slightly different, but even just things like just holding your chin up slightly, because often if we feel uncomfortable, scared, anxious, we're more likely for our body language to kind of close up. And so we might then, as we're kind of more shrinking ourselves, we're more likely actually then, so we're sending this information to our brain that we're not comfortable, we're more likely then to talk ourselves out of our own boundary, just kind of give in. So maybe things like shoulders back a little bit and chin slightly lifted might help you to reiterate and appear confident. But like we said, we do need to stick to our limits. So doing our best to avoid making exceptions. So say your boundaries are quite clear now with work in regards to how emotionally available you are. Even if you've got a friendly relationship with a colleague, we might still need to maintain that boundary, because actually once you've broken it elsewhere and you've spent all Friday night on the phone to this person talking about things, we're now maybe potentially more likely to also blur the boundary with other people in our team. And like we said, trying to be firm but fair, so a bit balanced, because the other person might also matter, and we might need to not just only think about ourselves sometimes. But just to kind of tie things together and pull things together, like I mentioned earlier, there are boundaries actually for the people in your teams, if you are more boundaried and it is clearer what your limits are, for example. So what benefits do people think there might be of you being more boundaried, not only for you, but for the people around you, for your employees, for your managers, for your friends, potentially, if you're thinking about boundaries there? Yeah, what benefits might there be for other people? Because boundaries do actually benefit other people. Okay, so things might be more structured, absolutely. Improve mental health. Yeah, if people are struggling with their mental health, they might struggle to set boundaries and advocate for themselves. And you can lead by example and show people how healthy boundaries can look. It can increase productivity. Things are clearer moving forward. It can protect their work-life balance. Absolutely. You leading by example and, showing the importance of having boundaries around like the hours that you work, how much you work, helps other people to recognize and believe that this is also important and it's okay for them to do the same. Also, I've just noticed in the chat, you'll be more present with people. People aren't getting let down if we overpromise when we can't deliver. We'll be more consistent, more fair. People know what's expected of them. Absolutely. People know what the limits are. So they know what is and isn't expected of them. They know what won't be tolerated and accepted if other people are pushing them and not listening to them and not respecting their boundaries. So boundaries essentially help us to not only look after our mental health and well-being, but be more sturdy, consistent leaders, where things feel safe for your teams. It can actually improve psychological safety significantly. So, like I said, thank you first of all for being here. I appreciate this has been a very, very quick whistle-stop tour, very tip of the iceberg introduction to boundaries as a manager. But like we said, hopefully it's still somewhat useful, even if it's just hearing from other managers that also understand that, or just hearing that, we all struggle with some things and there's always room for improvement. But yeah, hopefully still somewhat useful. And yeah, like I said, it's just something we're very, very passionate about, something that we're hearing about, thinking about an awful lot in sessions. If there is anything that we can do to support you and your teams, do let us know, get in touch, have a look on the website. There's loads of resources. We offer all of these free sessions regularly. So I think the next session's in a couple of weeks. Have a look on the website. But yeah, just thank you all for being here. Thank you for interacting and sharing. And thank you for taking this time for you. Like I said, boundaries are there for you as well as your teams. But yeah, other than that, I will respect the boundaries of your time limits. You have 30 minutes. We've been over 30 minutes. So thank you all so much for being here. Take care of yourselves. Have a peaceful rest of the week and hopefully see some of you again in the future. Bye, everyone. Take care. Bye for now.